Welcome, everyone, to the second day of the first ever online conference by the Center for Global Polytheist and Indigenous Traditions at Indic Academy, Polytheisms Today and Tomorrow. We have three panelists today. The third has not arrived yet. Hopefully he will be joining us, but we're going to go ahead with the first two presentations and a suitable discussion afterward. And if our third panelist doesn't show up, then we'll break a little early at my discretion. But right now, I'd like to introduce Adam Louis Klein. Adam Louis Klein seeks the place where the human, animal, and God intersect at the center of the universe. He has proposed sky-earth systems science as a pluralist cosmology that generalizes central insights of polytheist and animist metaphysics. He's currently a PhD student in anthropology at McGill University, studying with Eduardo Cohn. Louis Klein is also co-director at the independent open access journal Oscillations, Non-Standard Experiments in Anthropology, the Social Sciences, and Cosmology, a journal on which I also serve on the advisory board. I was very grateful for Adam's participation in the dialogue on pluralism yesterday, the first panel at the conference, and am pleased to welcome him here again for his main presentation. So go ahead.
Great. Thank you so much, Edward. And I'm really excited for another incredible day of discussion. My paper is called At the Crossing Place of Gods and Animals, the Sky-Earth System as Generic Cosmology. Animism and polytheism are neither doctrines nor mere philosophical positions. They ask us to think from the center of the universe. I here describe the center as an articulated system, what I call a generic cosmology, insofar as it incorporates both its own variation and the concrete development of positive content. A pluralist system requires being open enough not to be dogmatic, but diacritical enough not to be vacuous. To think from the center involves thinking the center in itself, and as such, with others. When I say the center, I speak in the same way as polytheists do when they say the God. For the definite article the has deictic properties. It indicates via context and presence and does not imply absoluteness. Compare then what Eduardo Viveros de Castro has noted for the term person in Amazonian worlds, which extends here horizontally to the animal, any finite other, who also sees themselves as human. We thus already have an indication that this center, where we are, is at the intersection of two others, the vertical, immortal God and the finite, horizontal other, the animal in the generalized, perspectival sense of Amazonian worlds. We already have a minimal triad, articulated with a basic duality, the sky and earth, which brackets the space of variation that I propose as generic. Rather than a dissemination or the universalization of the periphery, of which we are familiar due to what Francois Laruelle has called the philosophies of difference, Derrida, Deleuze, etc., a thinking from the center follows a logic of intersection. As in the widespread threefold model of the cosmos, sky, earth, underworld, or in the notion that the human lives between sky and earth, the human is a center because at the point of intersecting relations. It is a chiasmus structure, as in Levi-Strauss's canonical formula of myth, in which differences are neither reduced to indifferent identities nor endlessly diverging. They are ever crossing in the relativistic center, like a great snake curling around the world tree, up and down and around. It is like the cosmogram of the cardinal directions and the world mountains, familiar to us from Central Asia to Mesoamerica in the image of an X. In more formal terms, the two dualities, God/human, human/animal, in fact creates a four-term system where the human appears twice, as a mediating center between the other two terms, similar to the term be in Levi-Strauss's canonical formula. It is through this intersection and periodic return that the identity of these terms are indeed thought, God, human, and animal, and thus the superposition of worlds I propose. Francois Laruelle describes the principle of superposition as follows. Superposition is not a total or partial identification, but a special addition that qualitatively produces a result of the same nature as its terms, or what is idempotent. No term is alienated from the center, which prior to the division of the sky and earth and its crossing in the human would be but the God itself, in the non-space of what I call the original sky. A person is something divine. It cannot be defined by anything outside itself and holds itself in itself. The integrity of a person cannot be explained by who or what it is not. If a person is only a person due to others, then those others themselves are only so due to others. Either there is an infinite regress in which the person is not explained, or the chain circles around itself, in which case the person would be explained by a formal whole of relations, such that it would be a mere component, by all rights a thing rather than a person. And if this formal whole is a person, then it in turn would have to be explained by others under the assumption of the hypothesis to be rejected, creating a new whole, and so on ad infinitum. The Sky-Earth system then inhabits the realm of what Edward Butler has called positive individuation, without exclusive differentiation, or in the last instance, a differential determination. A universe identical to the divine person at its center, Sky-Earth system science is a kind of theurgy and worship. We rejoin the Egyptian and Greek notion of the cosmos as an image, statue, agalma of the gods themselves. Amazonians might speak instead of the patterned skin of a great anaconda. Sky-Earth Systems proposes a new method to study cosmology. Cosmology is neither the study of merely human beliefs and practices, neither a biologically reductive or culturalist sense, nor is it simply the proliferation of worlds within a differential meta-ontology, a whole that would dominate the parts. The Sky-Earth system only makes explicit this axiom of the center. It starts with a minimal duality, which, if it would not be factually universal, provides open vertical and horizontal parameters, the permutable positions of the God and the animal, within which to model the reciprocity of perspectives, and to trace the real theological roots of the modern extractivist cosmology, which, as Davi Copenhagen has warned, threatens to make the sky fall. In its content, it is a science, which is allied with today's scientific cosmology without demanding a mathematical approach or the specific epistemologies that may be prized by moderns as a condition of legitimacy. It is a study of and reverence for the universe itself. The first question generic cosmology asks is, why did the sky and earth distinguish themselves from each other? I propose that the center of the universe, since it is without extension, as such appears spatially as infinitely far away, on the other side of the sky. Here the unextended appears not only as infinitely small as in Leibniz's monad, but infinitely large. In fact, the center can be understood as the underlying identity of these two moments. This may be a certain response to the question of why there is space, derived from something non-spatial. It is consistent with contemporary physics' use of the holographic principle, which generalizes the information structure of a black hole to that of the universe itself. The universe would be but the extended surface of a non-extended existent. But more importantly, the identity of the center of the universe and the other side of the sky shows that the sky-Earth system can be understood as simply the non-dual dimensionality of the center. The reference to black holes, which provide a kind of litmus test for the very concept of stars, is felicitous, insofar as black holes are only found in the sky, reaffirming the duality of sky and Earth, rather than the flattening that Galileo and other moderns have claimed, and against the actuality of which Schopenhauer warns. The black hole's recession into itself, its event horizon and absorption of information, speaks to the very nature of the other side of the sky, as the inverse of the living star, which shines forth from what I call the visible sky. By thinking with the holographic principle, in which information would be just as much preserved on the surface of the black hole, it is as if the universe would be the very evolution of the black hole's center, a surface stretched and expanded between the center of the universe, where the Big Bang took place, and the other side of the sky. In future talks and publications, I hope to show that the Penrose diagram, which poses the universe, the parallel universe, black hole, and white hole around each other in a self-intersecting and 2x2 grid, is in a tight analogy with the chiasmus structure that I have suggested characterizes the sky-Earth system and nicely exemplified by certain icons in Mesoamerican cosmology. It is no wonder that planets and stars have so often been seen as the images of gods or of the dead, for they simply articulate the returning to the center that so many non-moderns prized as fundamental. They showed the center as something outside them, shining forth like little eyes piercing through the darkness, the image of something that was in them. It's a simple argument for the immortality of the soul. What may appear transcendent and what appears as immanent, the sky-Earth system sees in a non-dual way. It is important not to fall into a variety of confusions about an ascetic, absolutist, and transcendent sky versus a less authoritarian and more immanent Earth. In his 4-volume Mythologique, Levi-Strauss described a fundamental polarity in Amerindian mythology between the burnt world and the rotten world, or the long day and the long night. In either case, where the sun and the sky is either too close and stifling, or too far, alienated and disconnected from the earth. We need the breathing space, where what Schopenhauer calls the breath of the forest and the value of growth can circulate. We have to let the lungs of the universe expand before they contract again to the black hole and death trades place with life. That's what it means to say that humans, at the middle place, play a role in holding up the sky. The sky-Earth system, then, is a science of living well, precisely because it is a science of the universe at the place where human, animal, and God meet. It's about tracking what Earth system scientists call relationships of negative feedback, the balancing and offsetting mechanisms through which a fragile equilibrium, fit for the beings of whom it is in equilibrium, can be maintained. The moderns have overwhelmingly privileged self-reinforcing positive feedback, exponential J-form growth, asymmetric thinking, neurosis, and negative individuation. Whereas the sky-Earth system emphasizes negative feedback and positive individuation. The sky-Earth system here approaches a kind of transcendental generalization of Earth system science. In conclusion, it is now being said more and more often that the climate crisis and the Anthropocene requires new cosmological proposals, and those who have followed or developed the tendency known as cosmopolitics have emphasized the need for cosmologies that themselves are plural and distributed. I propose the sky-Earth as a minimal cosmology, one that I hope I have at least begun to show, by developing a few of its core concepts, is not only an accommodating frame, but a variable one open to positive invention. The visible sky, the other side of the sky, the world tree, black holes, the crossing place, the center of the universe. These are only some of the concepts that can emerge from it or can be put to new usages. The goal of this thinking is to reach the status of myth as a thought that simply riffs on itself in unending conceptual invention and freedom.
All right. I'm thinking that since in all likelihood, it'll probably be the two of us, I'm going to break from the way in which I did things at yesterday's panels, and I think have at least some discussion directly after each paper, and then possibly something further at the end. I'd like to contextualize a little bit for people who may not be familiar with the philosophical project which Adam is developing here. What you're seeing here, in essence, is an early stage in the process of formulating a structure whereby traditional cosmogonies could become full participants in the philosophical dialogue, which is carried on in real time in hegemonic languages, discourses, and institutions of higher learning. And so it's a question of developing a conceptual framework which is loose enough, let's say, generic enough to allow for the participation of these cosmogonies without imposing content upon them, without imposing some sort of alien substance upon them. And we can see this as the culmination of a slow arc that begins in, I mean, it may begin even earlier, but we can think of it as beginning with the emergence of indigenous discourse in Western philosophy in the form in which it's appropriated by Claude Lévi-Strauss in his structural anthropology. And if we think of this not as some positivist scientific project being carried out with indigenous discourses as passive participants, but instead as the early stage of the emergence of these traditions beginning to speak for themselves in the philosophical discourse, which then advances to a second stage in the work of Eduardo Viveros de Castro, who pushes structural anthropology further in the direction of the kind of open structure that Adam has taken to yet a further stage. Because in Viveros de Castro, what we have, he replaces the pure differential structure that Claude Lévi-Strauss establishes in the structuralist reading of myths, rituals, social organizations, all of the structures basically in traditional cultures. He creates a generic structure, a generic differential structure, let's say, so that instead of interpreting these things according to some lexicon of symbols that we would be imposing upon them, he places them in a purely differential structure so that they can begin to speak at least without being spoken over by content, because they're speaking in a purely formal fashion. Now, the next stage with Viveros de Castro is the emergence of a structure, what he calls perspectivism, which recognizes that what's constitutive for these mythic discourses is essentially the perspective positions of multiple human and non-human interlocutors. He basically reconceptualizes these myths as dialogues between human and non-human elements. Now, he primarily has in mind the other animals because he recognizes correctly that the central moment in the particular cosmogonies that he's looking at is the emergence of a separation between human discourse and the discourse of the other animals. This being a key moment in many of the cosmogonies that he's looking at, primarily Amazonia. Now, the way that I would characterize what Adam is doing here is that, for one thing, Adam is recognizing that among the non-human participants in this mythic dialogue are also gods. And so what we have then is the opening up of these additional axes. In addition to the perspective poles, he's now opening up these axes of sky and earth, which are sufficiently generic to be frameworks through which, of course, multiple cosmogonies can speak. And the formal characteristic that dominates it is the opening up of spaces, spaces between the earth and sky, a certain spaces of mediation with which all of these non-human components can enter into engagement with one another. And this space of engagement is what spirit workers in a host of different traditions, in every different tradition really, attempt to keep open and to keep fruitful. They're like a virtual ecosystem in which humans and non-humans can gather and be nourished by this space of interaction, you see. And the concern of spirit workers such as Davi Kopanawa, who is of the Yanomamo nation and has written very powerfully on this subject, is that we are entering a phase in which a catastrophic event could be occurring. It needs to be prevented, which he characterizes in terms of a falling of the sky, which I would essentially interpret as the catastrophic closure of these spaces, with the result that living beings, mortal living beings at any rate, will be forced into an underworld position. Essentially a position of death in life, which is being reduced to an object, being reduced to something instrumentalized for purposes that are inimical to life. And so the project then of bringing these traditional cosmogonies into the philosophical conversation isn't simply in order that we should have them as objects for some kind of intellectual enjoyment. The point is to prevent such an event, which is recognized as a real possibility and quite possibly something which has occurred in localized ways before, which is an interesting separate question. But in order to prevent this kind of possibility, this kind of foreclosure of spaces of mediation among non-human and human entities that would result in this kind of deathly objectification of living agencies, we need to bring these cosmogonies and the spirit workers who render them operative into a real-time intellectual environment where we can work to prevent this kind of spiritual catastrophe. And that, in essence, of course, is what we as polytheist revivalists as well are trying to accomplish. And so, although the language can be a little bit off-putting, and I mean, I should say, at least it has the virtue of being equally off-putting to people who come from a traditional philosophical background. And so, for once, I think at least we're kind of all on a common footing, because my friends who are coming from a predominantly spirit worker background, the terms are at least as accessible to them as they are to someone like a professional philosopher of some kind. And so I guess this is just my brief attempt to contextualize the project in which Adam is engaged, in which I regard as being extremely important and extremely promising, furthermore, for the potential of creating a genuinely different intellectual structure than we've been operating out of hitherto, and genuinely putting the practice of philosophical inquiry on a different footing, and I think a far more fruitful one.